war, empire, and ambition, what really shaped the United States into the nation it is today? A dramatic illustration of a U.S. soldier standing over a battlefield with the American flag waving in the background, smoke and fire rising, text overlay. The untold story of U.S. wars, cinematic, dark, and intense visual style. The story of the United States' rise as a military and global power begins with its earliest conflicts, the first wars of expansion that tested the young nation's resolve and identity. In 1812, tensions along the northern border erupted into a full-scale war with Britain, a conflict that would come to be known as the War of 1812. The border along the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River became a theater of both triumph and humiliation. The American Navy, though small, scored remarkable victories against its formidable British counterpart, demonstrating the resilience and determination of the fledgling United States. Yet, these victories were tempered by crushing defeats, especially along the strategic waterways of the St. Lawrence, which underscored the vulnerability of the young republic. The motivation for war were many, layered, and intertwined. The United States sought to drive the British away from its borders, asserting control over its territory and hoping to annex parts of Canada to secure its northern frontier. Britain, meanwhile, was determined to protect its lucrative maritime trade, and to do so at almost any cost. The conflict culminated dramatically in 1814, when British forces marched into Washington, D.C., and reduced the city's symbol of independence, the Capitol and the White House, to ashes. In the same year, a peace treaty was signed that restored the pre-war boundaries, but the war left a deeper imprint on the American psyche. It was, in the words of many historians, a war for survival, an assertion that the United States would remain a sovereign nation, capable of defending itself and asserting its place in the world. This early conflict laid the foundation for a narrative the United States would continue to craft about itself, a nation fighting for righteousness, a country claiming moral high ground while expanding its influence. From the northern borders, the focus of expansion inevitably shifted westward and southward. The Louisiana Purchase from France doubled the territory of the United States, opening vast new lands for settlement and exploitation. Negotiations with Spain brought Florida into the Union, and a careful compromise with Britain secured the Oregon Territory. Yet, these negotiations and acquisitions often came at the expense of indigenous peoples, whose voices and sovereignty were systematically ignored as the United States pursued its ambitions. In the Southwest, the story of Texas became one of legend, myth, and mythologized heroism. The city of San Antonio and the site of the Alamo would become symbols of bravery and defiance. In 1836, approximately 200 Texan rebels, including the famed frontiersman Davy Crockett, fought against a much larger Mexican army for 10 days. Every one of them fell in battle. Popular culture immortalized this stand as an example of courage against overwhelming odds, a defining moment in the American story. But the reality behind the legend is more complex. The settlers' primary goal was not simply freedom or independence, but the reintroduction of slavery, which had been abolished under Mexican law. The Alamo's fall triggered a rapid mobilization that ultimately led to the annexation of Texas into the United States roughly a decade later, shaping the future of the Southwest and setting the stage for further conflict with Mexico. The conquest of the American West was marked not only by conflict with neighboring nations, but also by violent campaigns against indigenous nations. The wars between the U.S. Army and Native American tribes were relentless, brutal, and often genocidal. In June of 1876, the famous Battle of the Little Bighorn took place in Montana, where Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer and his 7th Cavalry faced the combined forces of the Lakota Sioux and Northern Cheyenne, led by Chief Sitting Bull. Custer, a seasoned military officer and experienced Indian fighter, believed he could not be defeated, yet he underestimated the strength and tactics of the Native American forces. The result was a devastating defeat for the U.S. Army, with Custer and his remaining troops killed. Despite this loss, the narrative of heroism was constructed around Custer, reinforcing the myth of white military valor and marginalizing the achievements and struggles of Native Americans. After this battle, the United States government intensified its military campaigns, ensuring that indigenous populations were ultimately forced onto reservations, stripped of autonomy, and subjected to decades of systemic oppression. By the end of the 19th century, the frontier was declared closed, and the vast territories of the American West were under the control of the United States, paving the way for its emergence as a continental power. The transition from continental expansion to overseas imperialism began at the turn of the 20th century. The Spanish-American War of 1898 marked a turning point, as the United States projected its power far beyond North America. The war resulted in the U.S. occupation of territories thousands of kilometers away, including the Philippines, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. The American Navy, under the leadership of Vice Admiral George Dewey, achieved a decisive victory against the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay, demonstrating the growing reach and capability of U.S. military power. The United States, having annexed the Philippines, now found itself confronting an unexpected challenge. The local population did not welcome colonial rule. The Filipinos, yearning for independence, resisted American control through guerrilla tactics, leading to a prolonged and violent conflict that foreshadowed the types of insurgencies the U.S. military would encounter in future engagements around the globe. This era also saw the annexation of Hawaii and the assertion of American influence in Cuba and the Pacific, as the United States increasingly pursued economic and strategic interests under the guise of protecting national security. For decades, these overseas acquisitions and interventions established the foundation for a U.S. global empire, one that would later play critical roles in the world wars and in the strategic balance of the Cold War. The Vietnam War represented a profound turning point in American military history and public perception. Unlike previous conflicts, which were often narrated as clear struggles of good versus evil, Vietnam exposed the moral and political ambiguities of U.S. intervention. Televised coverage brought the realities of war into American living rooms, making the conflict immediate, visceral, and deeply controversial. As public opposition grew, the United States ended conscription and shifted to a professional military, fundamentally altering the relationship between society, politics, and the armed forces. For the first time, popular culture reflected skepticism toward military institutions, and narratives centered on individual experiences rather than heroic campaigns of the state. In the 21st century, the United States faced new and complex challenges in Iraq, Afghanistan, and beyond. The invasion of Iraq in 2003, justified on the basis of manipulated intelligence regarding weapons of mass destruction, resulted in thousands of deaths, destabilization, and unforeseen consequences, including the rise of ISIS and increased regional influence for Iran. Afghanistan, too, ended in failure after a protracted and costly campaign, echoing the humiliating conclusion of Vietnam. These conflicts highlighted both the limits of American power and the ongoing difficulty of translating military intervention into sustainable political outcomes. Despite setbacks, the United States continued to assert its influence globally. The 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine brought new challenges, testing the credibility of U.S. alliances and the reliability of its deterrence policies. Across Europe and Asia, the world watched as Washington weighed support for Ukraine, confronting the complexities of modern geopolitical strategy. The United States' ability to project power, maintain alliances, and respond to threats remained central to its identity as a global leader, yet it also revealed the constraints and dependencies that come with such responsibilities. The interplay between domestic politics, leadership changes, and foreign policy continued to shape American strategy. With each new administration, priorities could shift dramatically, from isolationism to interventionism, or toward the pursuit of supremacy and economic advantage. Presidents such as Donald Trump emphasized military strength and American primacy, asserting that the nation must prioritize its own interests, often reshaping the global order to reflect U.S. power and influence. This approach echoed the expansionist policies of leaders like William McKinley, who had extended American influence overseas at the turn of the 20th century, often for economic gain rather than moral objectives. Throughout this history, the military has remained both a tool and a symbol of American identity. From the fields of the Alamo to the open plains of the American West, from the jungles of Vietnam to distant bases in the Pacific, the armed forces have embodied the nation's ambitions, victories, and failures. Monuments such as Arlington National Cemetery and the Vietnam Veterans Memorial serve as solemn reminders of the human cost of these conflicts, and the narratives constructed around them continue to shape national memory, heroism, and the perception of what it means to be American. The story of the United States is one of expansion, conflict, and adaptation. It is a story in which ambition and ideology intertwine with pragmatism and power, producing both extraordinary achievements and profound tragedies. From its early wars along the northern border to modern geopolitical engagements, the United States has navigated a complex path toward global influence, often confronting moral ambiguities, domestic divisions, and the consequences of its actions. The history of American military and political expansion is far from a simple tale of triumph. It is a rich, layered narrative that continues to unfold, shaped by the choices of leaders, the courage and sacrifice of soldiers, and the enduring tensions between ideals and interests. The post-World War II era marked a dramatic transformation in the role of the United States on the global stage. With Europe in ruins and much of Asia devastated by years of conflict, the United States emerged as one of the two dominant superpowers in a new, bipolar world order. The military and economic power of the United States was unmatched, and the nation found itself thrust into a position of global responsibility, or, as some would argue, global enforcement. The decisions made during this era would define the trajectory of American influence for decades, shaping its relationships with allies, rivals, and the countless nations caught in the struggle between East and West. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, the United States oversaw the reconstruction of Europe through the Marshall Plan, a vast economic initiative designed to stabilize nations and prevent the spread of communism. Simultaneously, the U.S. established military bases across Western Europe, forming the cornerstone of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, in 1949. NATO not only served as a defensive alliance against the Soviet Union, but also solidified the U.S.'s role as the primary guarantor of security in the Western Hemisphere. At the same time, tensions with the Soviet Union escalated into the Cold War, a protracted geopolitical standoff that would define the second half of the 20th century. The Korean War of 1950 to 1953 represented the first major armed conflict of the Cold War era. When North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel into South Korea, the United States, under the banner of the United Nations, responded with a significant military intervention. The war was brutal, fought in freezing winters and scorching summers. It resulted in staggering casualties on all sides. While the conflict ended in an uneasy stalemate, with the border largely restored near the original dividing line, it established a precedent for U.S. engagement in Asia, a pattern of military intervention that would continue in Vietnam, Korea, and beyond. The lessons learned in Korea were clear. Containment of communism would demand commitment, resources, and, inevitably, sacrifices. By the early 1960s, the world had become a tightly connected global stage, with nuclear weapons creating the ever-present threat of total annihilation. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 brought the United States and the Soviet Union perilously close to nuclear war. Soviet nuclear missiles were discovered in Cuba, just 90 miles from the coast of Florida, sparking a tense standoff that lasted 13 days. President John F. Kennedy, advised by his closest military and civilian strategists, navigated the crisis with a combination of diplomacy, public pressure, and a naval blockade designed to prevent further deliveries of missiles to the island. The world held its collective breath as the United States and the Soviet Union edged toward what could have been a catastrophic global conflict. Ultimately, a secret agreement was reached. The Soviet Union would remove its missiles from Cuba, and the United States would quietly agree to remove its own missiles from Turkey. The episode demonstrated the high stakes of global power politics and underscored the United States' emerging role as an arbiter of international crises. Vietnam, however, would challenge this new perception of American strength and morality in unprecedented ways. What began as support for South Vietnam against communist insurgency quickly escalated into a full-scale war, a conflict that would consume resources, destabilize Southeast Asia, and profoundly divide American society. Unlike previous wars, the Vietnam conflict unfolded under the scrutiny of television cameras, making it the first war experienced directly in living rooms across the country. Every night, families witnessed the chaos, the loss of life, and the moral ambiguity of an intervention that many increasingly questioned. The U.S. military, once a symbol of unquestioned heroism, faced a crisis of legitimacy. Draft resistance movements, student protests, and anti-war activism fundamentally altered the relationship between the American public and its armed forces. Soldiers returning from Vietnam often found themselves disconnected from the society they defended, facing indifference or hostility rather than gratitude. The consequences of Vietnam reverberated far beyond the battlefield. The end of conscription transformed the U.S. military into a professional, volunteer force, forever altering the dynamic between civilian society and the armed services. Military policy, strategic planning, and political decision-making would now have to contend with an electorate increasingly wary of foreign entanglements. The shadow of Vietnam lingered over subsequent U.S. engagements, influencing public opinion and shaping the caution or overreach seen in later conflicts in the Middle East and beyond. The Gulf War of 1990 to 1991 marked a brief moment of perceived clarity in U.S. military intervention. When Iraq invaded Kuwait, the United States led a coalition to repel the aggressor and restore the sovereignty of a smaller nation. The conflict was characterized by technological superiority, precise military strategy, and overwhelming firepower, demonstrating the capability of a post-Cold War United States to project force decisively. Yet, even in this seemingly clear-cut conflict, deeper questions arose. What responsibilities did the United States bear to protect global stability, and at what cost? And how would success in one theater influence decisions in future engagements, where moral clarity was far less obvious? The 21st century would soon present challenges of a different nature, testing not just the military might of the United States, but the very assumptions underpinning its role in the world. The attacks of September 11, 2001, marked a dramatic shift in American foreign policy. The sudden, unprecedented devastation wrought by terrorist networks led to a swift and resolute response. The United States launched wars in Afghanistan and later Iraq, both framed as necessary to protect national security and prevent further attacks. Yet, these wars would prove complex, protracted, and costly, both in terms of human life and political capital. Afghanistan, the so-called graveyard of empires, resisted foreign intervention, presenting challenges that the U.S. military, despite its technological superiority, struggled to overcome. Iraq, invaded under the claim of weapons of mass destruction, descended into chaos, creating a vacuum that fueled sectarian violence and contributed to the rise of extremist groups such as ISIS. These conflicts revealed the limitations of even the most powerful military in shaping political outcomes and demonstrated how global ambitions could collide with local realities. Amid these challenges, the United States has maintained its position as a central actor in international security. Alliances, military bases, and strategic partnerships, stretching from Europe to Pacific, continue to anchor U.S. influence. In the Philippines, for example, the legacy of American military engagement has created a long-standing alliance that persists even as new regional tensions emerge, particularly with China's growing assertiveness in maritime regions. Across the globe, from Eastern Europe to the South China Sea, U.S. military presence serves both as a deterrent and a tool of influence, a testament to the complex balancing act of maintaining supremacy while navigating the moral and strategic implications of intervention. The American approach to foreign policy remains deeply influenced by the nation's history. Lessons from the past, wars fought for expansion, for ideology, for economic gain, inform contemporary decision-making, even as leaders confront unprecedented challenges. Every military engagement carries echoes of previous conflicts. Every foreign policy choice a reflection of historical patterns of ambition, caution, and the pursuit of power. The interplay of domestic politics, international pressure, and global perception continues to shape the United States' role as a superpower. Every administration must negotiate the tension between moral responsibility, national interest, and the unpredictable realities of global politics. And yet, despite these lessons and the often costly outcomes of military interventions, the United States continues to assert itself as a dominant global actor. The pendulum of American foreign policy swings constantly between interventionism and isolationism, reflecting both public sentiment and leadership priorities. In recent years, the rise of new global powers, China, Russia, and regional actors across the Middle East, has further complicated the landscape, challenging the assumption of unipolar American supremacy. Decisions about military engagement, alliances, and strategic positioning must now consider not only immediate outcomes, but long-term implications for global stability and the credibility of U.S. commitments. In the early 21st century, the United States found itself navigating an increasingly complex world order, one that no longer fit neatly into the binary frameworks of the Cold War. While the Soviet Union had dissolved decades earlier, new challenges emerged, some predictable, some unprecedented. The rise of China as an economic and military power, Russia's aggressive foreign policy under Vladimir Putin, regional instability in the Middle East, and the proliferation of non-state actors, including terrorist networks and transnational criminal organizations, created a global landscape in which American supremacy was contested in both traditional and unconventional ways. The election of Donald J. Trump in 2016 represented a significant shift in American foreign policy approach. Trump's philosophy was rooted less in the moralistic narratives that had guided previous administrations and more in a transactional understanding of power. He frequently emphasized the primacy of American interests, economic leverage, and military strength over alliances or global governance. For decades, U.S. policy had been shaped by a combination of ideological commitments to democracy, containment of rival powers, and the promotion of global stability. Trump, however, reframed these principles through the lens of America First, asserting that the United States could no longer afford to bear the costs of global policing without tangible benefits. This approach manifested in multiple arenas. In Europe, the long-standing NATO alliance came under scrutiny, with Trump repeatedly questioning whether member nations were contributing their fair share to collective defense. In Asia, the U.S. recalibrated its stance toward North Korea, engaging in unprecedented direct diplomacy with Kim Jong-un, while simultaneously reinforcing its military posture in the region to counter China's growing influence in the South China Sea. In the Middle East, Trump's decisions reflected a prioritization of strategic, economic, and energy interests over the long-term nation-building objectives that had dominated prior administrations. One of the central features of this era was the increasing reliance on technology and precision warfare. Unlike the large-scale, manpower-intensive conflict of the 20th century, modern U.S. military strategy emphasized drones, cyber capabilities, satellite intelligence, and special operations. Wars were no longer fought solely on traditional battlefields. Instead, dominance required control over information, surveillance, and rapid deployment. This transformation was both a response to the changing nature of threats, terrorist networks, asymmetric warfare, and hybrid conflict, and a reflection of America's technological superiority. Despite this, challenges remained. The ongoing conflict in Ukraine following Russia's invasion in February 2022 demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of U.S. influence. While American military aid, intelligence support, and strategic coordination bolstered Ukrainian resistance, the war underscored the reality that even the most powerful nation could not unilaterally determine outcomes on foreign soil. European allies, historically relying on U.S. protection, found themselves reassessing their own defense strategies, while China and other global powers observed the conflict closely, recalculating their own geopolitical ambitions. The lessons of history, the Vietnam quagmire, Iraq, and Afghanistan, resonated clearly. Military power alone could not resolve complex political, cultural, and territorial disputes. At the same time, domestic politics exerted an increasing influence on foreign policy decisions. In a nation where presidential elections occur every 4 years, long-term strategic consistency was difficult to maintain. Policies could shift dramatically depending on the administration in power, creating uncertainty both among allies and adversaries. Leaders like Xi Jinping in China or Vladimir Putin in Russia benefited from the ability to plan and execute strategies over decades, while American policy often had to adjust with each electoral cycle. This structural difference highlighted the tension between a democratic system with frequent leadership changes and the geopolitical realities of enduring global rivalries. Trump's approach, often criticized as unpredictable by foreign leaders and analysts, reflected a broader historical pattern of American expansionism, pragmatically asserting dominance where possible, relying on military superiority, and leveraging economic power to achieve strategic objectives. This mirrored the imperialist strategies of earlier eras, from McKinley's overseas ambitions to the conquest of Texas, the Philippines, and Cuba. Yet, unlike past interventions framed by ideology or moral justification, Trump's era was notable for its unapologetic pragmatism, power for the sake of national interest, economic leverage, and perceived security. Simultaneously, the United States continued to grapple with non-traditional threats: cyber warfare, information manipulation, terrorism, and economic coercion. While conventional armies and nuclear arsenals remained essential, the new battlefield extended into digital realms and global financial systems. Protecting supply chains, technological innovation, and infrastructure became as critical as defending borders. American policymakers increasingly recognized that 21st century supremacy was not solely measured in tanks, aircraft carriers, or missile silos, but also in the ability to control information, project influence, and maintain economic dominance in an interconnected world. The U.S.'s global military footprint remained substantial. Bases in Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and the Pacific allowed rapid deployment in crisis zones, but they also served as symbols of influence and, at times, sources of tension. For nations within the American orbit, this presence offered protection but also drew them into geopolitical rivalries, creating both opportunity and risk. For adversaries, U.S. bases represented a challenge to sovereignty and regional ambitions, fueling narratives of resistance and counteraction. Across the globe, the strategic calculus was increasingly complex, supporting allies, deterring rivals, managing global supply chains, and maintaining domestic political consensus, all while avoiding overextension and costly entanglements. The interplay between domestic politics and foreign policy became particularly evident in military budgeting and strategy. Congress, responsible for authorizing spending and oversight, often clashed with the executive branch over priorities, creating a delicate balance of power. Wars could not be waged without both public support and congressional approval, yet public opinion was increasingly shaped by instantaneous media coverage, social media commentary, and political polarization. Decisions that might once have been purely strategic were now subject to intense scrutiny, debate, and immediate feedback from both citizens and global observers. Even as the United States maintained its formidable military and technological capabilities, questions arose about the sustainability of its position. The rapid rise of China as a regional and global competitor, the resurgence of Russian assertiveness, and the emergence of new technologies capable of undermining traditional military advantage forced a re-evaluation of strategy. Unlike earlier eras, where supremacy could be projected through sheer force and territorial control, modern dominance required nuanced diplomacy, economic influence, intelligence superiority, and coalition building. The lessons of history, wars for territory, ideological conflicts, and the consequences of overreach, remained relevant, but the tools and metrics for success had evolved dramatically. In this context, U.S. foreign policy oscillated between caution and assertiveness. The pendulum of interventionism versus isolationism, visible throughout the nation's history, continued to swing, influenced by global crises, domestic politics, and evolving perceptions of national interest. From the wars of expansion in the 19th century to modern interventions in the Middle East and Asia, a consistent theme emerged. The pursuit of power, security, and influence often came at a high cost, morally, economically, and politically. As the 21st century unfolded, the United States' role in the world remained both prominent and paradoxical. Its military might, technological sophistication, and global economic influence ensured that no major conflict could occur without American involvement or observation. Yet at the same time, the United States faced increasing limitations, both externally from rising powers and internally from political divisions, public skepticism, and economic pressures. From Eastern Europe to East Asia, the American presence continued to shape global security. The war in Ukraine, a direct response to Russia's aggression, highlighted the continuing relevance of U.S. power in deterring territorial expansion by rival states. The provision of weapons, intelligence support, and strategic guidance strengthened Ukraine's resistance, showing that even in the 21st century, American influence could alter the course of a war without deploying mass conventional forces. Yet, the war also demonstrated the fragility of alliances and the limits of military intervention. European nations, while appreciative of U.S. support, increasingly recognized the need for independent defense capabilities, reshaping the balance of power on the continent. Meanwhile, in Asia, tensions surrounding Taiwan, the South China Sea, and North Korea reflected the growing complexity of global geopolitics. The United States had to navigate carefully, balancing deterrence with diplomacy. Military exercises, arms sales, and intelligence sharing became tools not just of defense, but of messaging, signaling to both allies and adversaries that the U.S. remained a decisive force. Yet, the rising economic and military capabilities of China presented a long-term challenge that required strategic patience and innovation rather than immediate confrontation. The United States also grappled with threats that were not confined to conventional battlefields. Cybersecurity emerged as a critical domain, with nation-states and non-state actors alike capable of targeting infrastructure, financial systems, and communications networks. Global pandemics, climate-related disasters, and mass migrations further complicated the nation's foreign policy priorities. The lessons of past conflicts, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, remained instructive. Military power alone could not secure objectives, and strategic miscalculations carried long-lasting consequences. Domestically, the American public perception of war and military engagement continued to evolve. In the era of 24-hour news, social media, and instantaneous communication, citizens could witness conflicts in real time, shaping opinions and influencing policy. The experiences of past wars, both triumphant and disastrous, created a cautious population aware of the human, economic, and moral costs of military intervention. The tension between maintaining global influence and avoiding entanglement became a defining feature of modern American politics. Through all these complexities, one constant remained: the enduring connection between military power, economic strength, and national identity. The United States military bases around the globe, its alliances, and its technological dominance served not only strategic purposes, but also symbolic ones, projecting a narrative of resilience, capability, and deterrence. Yet, as history repeatedly demonstrated, the projection of power required careful balance, foresight, and humility. Overreach could lead to quagmires, misjudgment to global instability, and neglect to diminished credibility. As we reflect on this long arc of American history, from the early wars of expansion to modern-day global interventions, it becomes clear that the United States has always been a nation striving to define its place in the world. Each conflict, each policy decision, and each act of diplomacy contributes to a larger story of ambition, triumph, and caution. The lessons of the past: territorial conquest, wars for empire, interventions abroad, inform the choices of the present and the strategy of the future. They remind us that power, while formidable, is never absolute, and that with influence comes responsibility. The story of the United States, like that of any great power, is neither entirely heroic nor wholly tragic. It is a story of ambition and restraint, of victories and mistakes, of ideals pursued and compromises made. It is a narrative still being written, shaped by the decisions of leaders, the resilience of citizens, and the unpredictable currents of history. And as we watch the world today, we see the echoes of centuries of expansion, conflict, and diplomacy reverberating through every geopolitical decision, every military strategy, and every alliance forged or tested. As we conclude this examination of America's historical and contemporary role on the global stage, we invite you to reflect on these patterns of power, ambition, and consequence. How do you perceive the balance between national interest and global responsibility? What lessons can be drawn from past conflicts to guide the future? We encourage you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Your insights contribute to an ongoing dialogue about history, strategy, and the ever-evolving story of nations. And if you found this deep dive into the history and influence of the United States insightful, don't forget to like this video, share with others who are curious about history and geopolitics, and subscribe to our channel for more comprehensive documentaries and analyses. By subscribing, you become part of a community dedicated to understanding the complexities of global history and contemporary affairs, one story at a time. The story of power, ambition, and human endeavor continues, and your engagement ensures that these lessons are not forgotten. Stay with us as we explore the past, understand the present, and anticipate the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead.